right along the street that will be named for her. There used to be 4 Victorian San Francisco-style duplexes that came up here along Whedon Street and at the head at Bravo Street, and they're all sadly gone. But the one that was right here was the Johnson family homestead. And I remember when they tore it down in the 1980s, they found behind the baseboard a 1922 application to join the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, signed by Reverend G.A. Johnson, Carrie Johnson's grandfather, so a century ago from that spot. Now, Carrie's last Lincolnville home was right behind it, facing out on Riberia Street, and she lived there until one of these terrible hurricanes came and sent the water rushing through the house. And after that, sadly, there was not affordable housing in Lincolnville or the voice of Lincolnville, so she spent her last years in St. Augustine Shores. Now, why is this street name going to be Carrie Johnson Way? Why not Boulevard or Avenue or Street or Lane? Well, you know, Reverend Andrew Young, who has much connection with St. Augustine, wrote a spiritual autobiography, which he called A Way Out of No Way. And I thought that Carrie Johnson's life emulated that. How do you get through hard times? I don't know anybody who had less than Carrie and accomplished more than Carrie. And I think that will be an inspiration to the future. So in the future, this will be Carrie Johnson Way. Now, you can't get away from a history lesson with me. I have to tell you, this is not just any piece of dirt and concrete and asphalt in the ancient city. This was, in fact, a 5-acre orange grove here before the Civil War that was owned by Benjamin Putnam, for whom neighboring Putnam County is named. And Mr. Putnam's daughter married in sequence 2 of the sons of John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator and vice president of the United States. So that's how the Calhoun name came down here even before the Civil War. And when the Civil War came, St. Augustine was under Union control for most of that Civil War, and the Putnams and others who were Confederate sympathizers left the city and went behind the Confederate lines inland, and they didn't pay their taxes. So this land was put up at a tax sale, and it was bought by a very interesting person. People have often asked me, did Abraham Lincoln have anything to do with Lincolnville? And the answer is, well, actually, the man who owned this piece of it was Abraham Lincoln's private secretary. His name was John Hay. He later became Secretary of State. And he bought this land at a tax sale during the Civil War, and he kept it for several years, and I've read his correspondence, and he complains. He was an absentee owner most of the time, but he said his growth manager would write to him and say, we had a good crop this year, but he never sent any money along with it. So finally he got disgusted, and he sold it to another man connected to Abraham Lincoln, General Henry Shelton Sanford, hence Sanford Street over there. And General Sanford was Abraham Lincoln's chief diplomatic troubleshooter in Europe during the Civil War. And he kept this property for many years and finally developed it as a subdivision called Fountain City. And that's from the time period where you see the old Victorian houses that dot this neighborhood. Now, last year, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, providing for women's suffrage. And this is an area particularly connected to women's history in St. Augustine. Down at the corner there was the home of Evelyn Hamlin, who became the first woman elected to public office in St. Augustine when she served on the school board in the 1920s, and there's an Evelyn Hamlin school named for her. This neighborhood was also the home for St. Augustine's first female mayor, Ramel Petroglou, who is still with us here today. And right around the corner there was the home of Helen Hunt West, who became the first woman to register to vote in Duval County, the first female member of the Florida Bar Association, and a leader with Alice Paul of the National Women's Party. And that beautiful tan-colored house there with all the porches was the home of Mattie Rutherford, for whom Mattie Rutherford School in Jacksonville is named. And of course, this was Carrie Johnson's last home. So what an incredible collection of women's history, just as we have celebrated the 100th anniversary of that amendment. Now, Carrie is known for her music, and it may have been providential that one of her childhood babysitters lived right down the street at number 114. Her name was Emmeline Maltsby. You probably don't know her under that name, but if you look her up in the Encyclopedia of Jazz, you will find her listed under the stage name that Louis Armstrong suggested she adopt, and that is Debbie Moore. And she made records here and in England. She appeared in movies in Japan. She traveled the world. She sang with Earl Father Hines and other legends of jazz. And then she came back to St. Augustine and worked as a maid, because we had no openings for jazz singers here in St. Augustine. Those of us who knew her before she passed away a few years ago knew her not as Emmeline Maltsby or Debbie Moore, but under the name of her later life, Debbie McDade, and she was an extraordinary person indeed. Now, Carrie, as she was growing up, was encouraged in music. She was a regular listener to a radio program broadcast nationally called Wings Over Jordan. And I understand Martin Luther King was also an enthusiastic listener to that program. And Carrie had childhood dreams of maybe going to the Juilliard School of Music in New York. And those did not work out. But later, when she was living in the North, she was a member of the famous Salt and Pepper Gospel Choir that performed at Yale University and on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. When she came back to St. Augustine in the early 1990s after the devastation caused in South Florida by Hurricane Andrew, she first thought to make a living as a street singer on St. George Street. And she was a very good singer, but unfortunately the city outlawed street singers. So she was one to find a way out of no way. So she recorded her songs, and this is where the name Voice of Lincolnville comes from. She made a tape called The Voice of Lincolnville, and she would sell it when she performed and when she appeared. She also devised a program called History Through Song, because so much a song involves history, and she would love to sing Steal Away to Jesus and tell of its origins as a way to escape on the Underground Railroad. And she also did, I have in my living room an old Civil War era rifle hanging up, and it's there not because I'm a military buff or anything, it's there because Carrie used it as a stage prop in her one-woman show as Harriet Tubman, which she performed around the state for many years. Now, Carrie loved the cultural figures of St. Augustine's past, particularly two famous authors who lived here in the 20th century, Zora Neale Hurston and Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And she put together extensive scrapbooks on both of them. And she was active for many years in the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society. I recall road trips with her to Melbourne and Apalachicola and DeLand and St. Petersburg, and she was always a highlight there. And so one year, a scholar discovered that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings had written her high school class song in 1914 to the tune of Believe Me of All Those Endearing Young Charms. And we were having the meeting of the Rawlings Society in St. Augustine that year, and we said, we should get our best local singer to sing this. So Carrie learned that song and sang it for the first time in 85 years to the Marjorie Rawlings Society meeting in St. Augustine in the last years of the 20th century. Now, Carrie's accomplishments have been mentioned, and they would go on and on. She was one of the founders of Accord, and she is the one who told Mrs. Gwendolyn Duncan to please get involved in Accord. And St. Augustine history has never been the same, thank God. She was an Olympic torchbearer. She was on the committee that gave us that beautiful monument in the plaza to the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. Of course, one of the projects of Accord is the Freedom Trail all around. And I can tell you some of the inside stories of putting up the Freedom Trail because those markers had to be mounted in concrete pads there. And we had to tell the mason who was going to come pour the concrete where it should go. And how did we do that? Carrie Johnson took a piece of yellow poster board the size of a Freedom Trail marker and went around and stood on the spot where we wanted it to be. And I snapped a photograph, and we gave it to the mason, and then he would go around with his equipment and pour the base for those. So wherever you see a Freedom Trail marker, you are probably in the footsteps of Carrie Johnson. And it never stops, you know, even in her last years when she had lost part of her leg and was in a wheelchair. I remember her at the dedication of Robert B. Hailing Freedom Park down the street. And being Carrie, you could hear her voice above all others. And it was a hot day and the sun was beating down, and all of a sudden you heard Carrie say, "You need to plant some trees here." My sentiments exactly. Now, I think that the historians of the future will judge that Carrie Johnson is one of the most consequential religious figures in St. Augustine's history, ranking right up there with Father Pedro Camps, the patron saint of the Menorcans, and Father Felix Varela, one of the national heroes of Cuba. And Carrie did not have a church, strictly speaking. She grew up in St. Paul AME Church, but I always thought that Carrie's pulpit was that famous three-wheeled vehicle that she alternately called her Rolls Royce or her Lamborghini. And her church was really the streets of St. Augustine. And her congregation was everyone. And the devil in her religion was what she always called the invisible vapor of racism that disfigured our city and that she tried to overcome. And all of her prayers began with, "Hi, darling," that everybody remembers. Carrie was a veritable force of nature, and she inspired all of us to do our best and better, and we are grateful to her, and we hope that for generations to come, people will look at those street signs and say, "Tell me about that woman," and they will be duly impressed with the stories they hear. Thank you all so much for coming.
Amen. Amen. That was awesome.